Okay. Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. The purpose of today's presentation is to provide the public with an update on the financial condition of Lackawanna County through the end of 2024. In January, Commissioner McGowan and I had the county apply for inclusion into the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development Strategic Management Planning Program. The STAMP program assists counties who are experiencing fiscal difficulties develop comprehensive multi-year financial plans and establish short and long-term financial objectives. Lackawanna County was accepted into the program, and DCED provided $100,000 in grant funds to hire financial experts to help us work through a myriad of issues. PFM was chosen in early April and got right to work. They are here this morning, represented by Gordon Mann, to give us an update and provide recommendations to help Lackawanna County get through the end of this year. Since this is a presentation, there will be no public comment, but PFM and the commissioners and our CFO, Dave Bolzoni, will be available afterwards for any questions from the media. And I'll turn it over to Gordon Mann.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, commissioners, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I appreciate the opportunity our firm has been given to work with the county here with this important engagement. A bit of background, PFM stands for Public Financial Management. It's not a creative title, but it is a descriptive one. It's what we do. We work around the country almost exclusively with public sector organizations. I work basically exclusively with governments here in Pennsylvania. Have been through this process with a number of county governments, Luzerne, Lycoming, Beaver, Cumberland, and have done some similar work in other counties outside of the program. What we've been brought in to do overall is what Commissioner Gaughan had described earlier this year as an MRI of county operations and finances. And I'll use a handful of medical allegories as we go throughout the process. But the way we start and the way we start this engagement and the overall picture is focused on financial stability. That's the goal here. The goal is to get Lackawanna County government to a position of financial stability. And there's 3 steps to that. You can think crawl, walk, run. The most basic part of your financial stability is whether you can pay their bills when they're due, what we call cash flow stability or cash flow analysis, which is what we're going to talk about mostly today. The second part of your stability is if I can pay my bills today, can I pay them for the rest of the year? That's budgetary stability. And the county earlier this week, I believe, started its meetings on the 2025 budget. And we'll be back to provide some analysis that's related to that. And then at the end, what we've been brought in and what the overall goal for the Commonwealth here is structural stability. Can you pay your bills not just tomorrow, but in 2025 and 6 and 27? And do your recurring revenues cover your recurring costs? Because once you get to that point of financial stability, that's the point at which you can start to think more strategically. But if you have a situation, they cautioned me that would happen. But if you have a situation where you can't pay your bills today, then you can't think about your future in terms of strategically tomorrow. So this morning, we're going to focus just on the first aspect of this. We'll be back to talk about budgetary and structural stability, but this morning we're here to do 3 things. Talk about the county's cash position in its general fund. So I know there's at least one person in the audience who's from a department not in the general fund, and we are focused explicitly on the general fund this morning. The cash position in that fund through the midway through this year. Present our projections for where the county would finish this year on a month-to-month and an annual basis, and then make our recommendation at the end. I don't believe in burying the lead. You know, if the headline here is that the county has about an $11 million deficit on a cash basis, and I'll talk about what that means, but a deficit at the end of the year. And so we have to come up with a plan to close that, and we have to start that process now. While I am new to this, most of you in the room are not, and this problem should not be new to you either. I picked up wind of this from our colleagues who work with the county on debt issuance, and they had talked to, and they had tipped us off from the 3 commissioners here that the county entered this year with about $6 million in its general fund bank account. That's less than 1 month worth of cash. And the only reason it entered with $6 million and not something less is in the second half of last year, the county basically got to the point where its cash flow, where it had to stop paying some of its bills to other vendors. made its payroll payments, paid its benefits, kept the lights on, all of that sort of stuff. But payments to vendors were basically held in abeyance because the county did not have enough cash. And coming into 2024, there was about $18.5 million worth of outstanding bills due to vendors, about more than half of which I would consider late. If you have a bill that's 1 day old, that's not late. If you have a bill that's more than 30 days late, or 60 or 90, those are late bills. So that was the problem coming into this year. And for those of you who followed this going along, this should also not be new. Last fall, the county in the process had its credit rating reviewed. Credit rating is where an outside agency says, this is how much risk I associate with you paying your debt in full and on time. That's a credit rating agency's focus. They're focused on whether you're going to pay your debt. And they assigned ratings to it, and that rating then sets your borrowing. The riskier you are to not pay your debt, the higher your cost for borrowing. And Lackawanna County had been an A-. The structure's weird. It's not there. You could go AAA, so it's not doesn't correlate with the academic grade calendar. But the county was lowered from A- to BBB+ with a negative outlook. The negative outlook is the credit association's way of saying we think things could get worse before they get better unless you take this type of corrective action. The things they cite in their report, probably should have quotes on this, but this is directly from their report. Structure imbalance without a clear plan to return to consistent budget balance, weak budgetary performance with continued deficits, persistent budget pressure. I promise I won't read all of the slides. You can see for yourself from there. The key point is the language. Structural imbalance, continued deficit, persistent pressure, continued reliance. Those all point to a problem that has developed over time. And that is what the county's numbers point to, too. If you look at the county's annual audits, three numbers we like to focus on: how much cash do you have, how much reserves do you have, that's what fund balance means, and how much do you owe outside organizations, that's accounts payable. And all the trends over the last 4 years, don't have the 2023 audit yet, but over the last 4 years, they're all going the wrong direction. The amount of cash is dropping, reserves is dropping, the amount of bills that you carry over at the end of the year is going up. So let's talk about where now that we've talked a little bit about setting what has been the county's challenge, let's talk about what success looks like, because this will be important when we talk about what the deficit is. Our goal is to get a plan in place for this year, and again, we're focused on cash flow, so we will come back and talk about structural deficit later, but to get the county in a position where the general fund, which is a series of bank accounts that funds most but not all of operations, where we have three things. One, you obviously want to continue core daily operations, pay people's salaries, pay people's benefits, make the pension contributions, and I do not believe there is a risk here of that not happening by the end of the year, right? We'll talk about what the deficit means, but that risk has not reached the point yet where you need to worry about that or the county not being able to make its payroll to the end of the year. That is not what we're saying. You need to be able to pay all of the identified bills on time to basically unchain yourself from the anchor that the county has carried in the past. If Lackawanna County brought $18.5 million in unpaid bills into this year, the goal is to bring zero into next year. Because as long as you bring part of last year with you, you can never go forward. You can never move faster if there's an anchor tied to your ankle. And some of that is a cash flow problem, and some of that is a structural problem. But we have to get the sharpest and heaviest anchor off first, cash problem. And the last thing that defines success, it's technical but important. The county at the beginning of the year borrowed $15 million to meet its obligations in the early part of the year. It's not unusual. There's nothing wrong with that. That is common practice. We got to pay it back by December 31st. Why? Well, a variety of reasons, including we'll need one again next year. So at the end of the year, you'll see when we look at the expenditures, there's a surge in December that is the repayment of that loan. Two really important things here in blue for those who can read them. Number one, we're not trying to balance to zero. You guys will remember the movie, It's a Beautiful Life, or It's a Wonderful Life, where at the end, George Bailey closes the door and locks it and says, oh, we've got $2, mama and papa dollars better have babies. The bad news for George is the next day comes, and there's a 2025. So we cannot balance to zero. We need some cash. Even if it's just to get us to the next cash flow loan, we're not trying to balance to zero here. What's the right number? I was looking in the newspaper this morning, Berks County, which would be Reading is, that would be a comparator of Lackawanna County. Their rule of thumb is 3 months worth of operations. 36, something like that. We normally start at 2, right, which would be 24. None of those numbers is 6, right? And that's what the county brought into this year. But if you're thinking how much cash is enough cash or how little cash is too little, that's to give you a sense of magnitude. So that's the first thing. We're not trying to balance to zero. The second is, again, success is defined not just by merely making it through the year and paying people's paychecks and keeping the lights on. That should be a given. Success is defined by not carrying excess amount, or really any, as far as we can get it down, of past due bills into next year. It's to draw a line in the sand with the commissioners here who are taking this problem on after years and say no more. All right, we're fixing this problem right now. For some of the accounting folks in here, I won't agonize over this too much, but our methodology, the way this works is we build a cash flow model. We take 5 years worth of historic data. We evaluate it to say, okay, in general, how much does the county collect and how much does it spend from its major sources every month? And then we evaluate the monthly results to see how they compare. So if on average, not if, this is true, on average, the county collects about 5.5% of its real estate tax revenue every month, every July, and we get the July numbers, which I think we probably just requested, and it's more than 5.6%, we say, okay, is that we're getting more money or are we just getting it faster? If it's less than 5%, does that mean we're getting less money or we're just getting it slower? So that's the idea. You do a monthly projection of what you expect, and then every month you say, okay, how does reality connect to what I expected? So every month we would look at the results. These results that you're seeing here are through June. We kept them through mid-year because I think that's most intuitive for thinking kind of halfway through the year. We would do this at the end of July and at the end of August and at the end of September, where the books would close and we would look at the monthly results and say, okay, now do we expect? Because while we want to emphasize that we're thoughtful and we're careful, we're not wizards. We can't predict the future. These are projections, and we will need to be able to revise and move with reality. What you can see, though, if you focus on the graphic as opposed to the words, is that at the end of the year, the projection shows the county running an $11.3 million cash deficit in its general fund by the end of December. Obviously, you can't run a cash deficit. You can't pay people with negative cash. So what that would mean is the county would have to carry about $11.5 million of past due bills into next year, and the can would get kicked down the road one more time, right? The problem that the county has been struggling with would go one more year into the future, right? So again, our goal here is not just to have that red number that you see at the lower right-hand part of the screen. It's not to make it zero. We're not trying to balance to zero. And it's not just to get through this year by, again, putting bills off. It's to pay all of the bills, or as many of them as you practically can, and to finish this year, my target would be about $6 million, which again, that would be, the reason I would pick $6 million is what you started this year with, right? So at least you don't go further behind. It's not 1 month, it's not 2 months, it's not 3 months, but you have to start somewhere. Let's talk a little bit about how the county finances work. Lackawanna County government, like actually most Pennsylvania governments, but especially county governments, gets most of its revenue early in the year. They get it from the real estate tax. Pennsylvania county governments, they only have a real estate tax. Income tax is reserved for school districts and localities. Sales tax is reserved generally for the state. So real estate is it. It's the only show in town in terms of local taxes for Pennsylvania county governments from a major perspective. And most of that revenue comes in the first 5 months of the year. The bills go out. People pay them, or their bank pays them, or their mortgage escrow pays them, or however it works. And by this point in the year, you know what you're going to have for most of your revenue. So we sit here on August 15th. Again, the actual numbers presented through June. You can see that most of that curve has already happened. Most of the county's revenues have already been collected. You see a few spikes that are not the gray line. The gray bar is the real estate tax. At the beginning of the year, that orange block, that's the $15 million cash flow loan. You'll see it'll come out the other side on the expenditure side on the next slide. Departmental revenues, this is everything from fees, but what it largely is payments from other levels of government. One of the really crucial things about county government is on a revenue basis, once you get through your real estate tax, you really don't control your own fate. A lot of your reimbursements come from the state. You have some payments from the federal government for inmates at the prison. There may be some other levels of government, but unlike a local government, which has an income tax, or I guess the state government, which has the sales tax, you are dependent on other organizations to send you what are largely reimbursements, where, for instance, Youth and Family Services would get those expenses would get made by the county and then reimbursed by the state. But it doesn't happen automatically. There's a time lag there. The last little spike at the end of the year, the county has just completed a debt refinancing. That should funnel about $5 million in savings back to the general fund. We're showing it in December. It will probably be earlier, but that's what that last little orange block is at the end of the year. And that refunding has already been completed, timing for when the process is wrapped up. So let's talk about where county spends its government, or spends its money. Mostly it's people. County government is people. They don't build aircraft carriers or things like that. County government is caseworkers, it's corrections officers, it's district attorneys, it's that sort of thing. It's people. So most of the expenses are personnel, and unlike the revenues, which are concentrated in the first 5 months of the year, the expenditures are distributed evenly throughout the year. Payroll every 2 weeks, health insurance at the end of every month, electricity bills, those sorts of things. So the revenues, the goal is you want to hit as high a peak as you can in spring, and then the expenditures is you want to spend at a level so that by the end of the year you haven't exhausted your peak. That's the game that really all county governments play from a cash flow perspective. You can see that the expenses are mostly even. Gray is personnel. Again, this is salaries, health insurance, this is overtime. You see a couple of spikes in July. That is the county receiving a portion of the real estate tax and putting it in either its debt or its culture and education fund. There are separate millages for those two purposes. The county gets all the money in one hand and then puts it in the other two buckets, and that occurred in July. And then that big orange block at the end of the year, that's the $15 million. That's the other side of the orange block on the January. It comes in January and then goes out in December. Put those two lines together, and this graph will look very familiar. It was just on 2 slides ago. This is the count. This is the projection, right? So you hit that peak in April, and then you have to ride the peak down. You need to get to the end of the hill before the year ends. You need to have your expenses not dwindle that down to 0 or lower before the clock runs out on the year. That is, in essence, the challenge. And right now, we show, again, the county running out of cash. So what that would practically mean is carrying $11.3 million in bills into next year. And incidentally, even in November, it starts to get a little bit tight.
Could you switch mics? That mic is starting to lose its battery.
Word out.
The word is dropping out. Thanks.
Test, 1, 2. All right. So let's talk about what causes the cash flow crisis. First, let's talk about what, at least this year, is not causing it. The challenge here, for this year at least, is not that the county is spending way more than it budgeted or that it collected way less than it expected. The chart to the right shows our projections, and again, they will change and be updated throughout the year. I guarantee you that these numbers will look different 30 days, 40 days, 60 days from now. But from right now, what we show on that projection is that the county is basically on meeting and following its budget, right? There is a little bit, the budget doesn't have the cash flow loan in it because you don't generally track that from a cash perspective, but we are on our side. But in general, the real estate taxes are coming in a little lower, about $400,000, but that's on a $104 million base. Departmental revenues, a little low, other miscellaneous revenues offsetting that, and more or less on target from a revenue perspective. From a spending perspective, we're showing the county saving about $4.5 million. And for the operations folks in the crowd, saving means not filling positions and not filling vacancies, right? So from my perspective on the finance side, that's a positive thing. From an operations side, it's a different story. But we're showing, because of the vacant positions that the county has, that net of overtime, the combination of lower spending on health insurance and lower spending on salaries should save about $4.5 million this year. Now, there are some other things that offset that. There's some additional costs anticipated on the Youth and Family Services side, where the county has to get has to hire people, has to get contractors in place, has to meet that demand for service, and that may push the costs a little bit higher. But if you go all the way down to the bottom and you just focus on those numbers, those are millions, but they're not, because they're all less than 1. So the projected deficit on a budgetary basis this year, right now, is $900,000. Again, the world could change. We will continue to update that. But the county does not have an $11.3 million cash flow deficit because it's $900,000 behind on its budget, right? Those two numbers are not the same thing. So what is causing this? Well, actually, before we get to that, let me. This is the highlight. You will definitely come out of this going, gee, I guess PFM really wants them to pay their bills, and we do. This is one of the metrics on the scoreboard for our success, right? Cash in the bank at the end of the year, and it shouldn't be zero, and it can't be negative, and bills paid. This is the flow of bills paid over the year. These are the older bills, so it's not all 18.5, but the older bills at the end of January. You can see it's about 9. February, it goes down, March a little up, and then in recent months, it's around $1.3 million. That is focus on paying your bills. That's also just the way things work. If you think about when your cash flows in, if I have most of my cash in the first 5 months, then I will pay most of my bills in the first 5 months. So what is causing the cash flow shortfall? Let's talk about this in the basic terms and then in the long terms. The county, in effect, brought an extra month worth of expenses into 2024, right? If the average cost of operations is $12 million, and the county brought $18 million, or depending on the date you're using, somewhere around there, in the teens into this year, what has effectively happened is the county is paying for the 12 months of 2024 and December, if you want to think of it as that, of 2023. You have 12 months worth of revenue, because that's what a budget is, but you have 13 months of expenditures because one of those months could not be covered last year. So that's condensing down the cash flow problem into one statement. And the problem for county governments is because they are so dependent on one very flat, fixed source of income, the real estate tax, you never really get the chance to catch up. So a city government may have great things going on in its economy, and it may pick up revenue from the income tax, or a bunch of properties sell and you pick up something from the deed transfer tax. County doesn't have those options. It gets what it bills based on its reassessment. And so you don't really, on the revenue side, have a great chance to make up the gap, right? To catch up and to generate enough cash to pay for that 13th month of services. So that's the short-term issue. The longer-term issue, though, is what we talked about way back here. If you have a structural deficit, if you can't pay your expenses because the revenues don't grow and the expenditures do, eventually you end up making hard, bad decisions. Eventually you end up saying, I guess we won't make the pension payment this year, which is not what's happening this year, but has happened in the past. Or I can't pay these bills right now, I have to wait. This is a manifestation of a long-term problem. Now, we need to address the short-term acute, here's the medical allegory, we need to address the short-term symptoms, we need to get people back on their feet, we need to get them out of bed, but we can't miss the underlying medical issues here, the structural imbalance, because if we do, we will fix this now, and then 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, however long it takes, we're flat on our back again, back in bed. So we need to address the acute short-term need, that's the cash flow issue, and the structural imbalance. So how do we do that? These are PFM's recommendations, and this is how we would approach this, right? So two sides of the ledger. The revenue side is not going to help us a whole lot close our $11.3 million deficit. We can't do a mid-year tax increase. We can't ask the state or the federal government to reimburse us for services that haven't been delivered yet. The best we can do is make sure that the money we're supposed to get on the revenue side, we collect and we get on time, because we need it. So we focus on the expenditure side. What I've recommended, or what we have recommended here, is a hiring freeze, subject to the commissioner's discretion, where basically the commissioners would say, we will fill these positions out of operational necessity, but these other ones have to wait. So what would go on the have to fill? The caseworkers, the NOIFIS, probably the corrections officers, I know there's some struggles in the district attorney's office so in terms of filling positions, so those may all be on the list, but not all of them, right? There are vacancies here that you would have to put off to fill until next year once you get through the cash flow crisis. The way this should work is the commissioners would say to the departments, we have a hiring freeze, and so we're stopping the hiring process now before the candidates come to our desk, because you don't want your HR department and your other departments out there to go through the exercise of identifying a candidate just to find out they can't hire him at the end. Again, there would be exceptions, and this would not touch the employees in other funds that are completely separate from the general fund, because that's not what we're talking about this morning. But that would be the first thing, because that $4.6 million in personnel savings, we need that, right? We need that to get back to positive, and if we can get more than that, then at least from a financial perspective, even better. I am aware that this is a hard decision, and this, therefore one the commissioners have to make on the operations side, because there would be an operational impact if you don't fill all your vacancies. County government is people, people do the work. If you don't have the people, then you can do less work, right? That is a simple function here. So I recognize that this is a short-term operational hit to try and get the county in the right place financially. Because what's a longer-term operational hit is if you can't pay anybody. The second thing what we would recommend is a halt on what I'm calling discretionary spending. This would be anything that is not salaries, benefits, electricity, whatever, basic supplies that you need to continue county government operations. If there is something that the county government is doing, and largely there isn't a whole lot of long-term investments, but if there's something that the county is doing because it's a great idea that will be wrapped up in the next 3 years, this is not the time for that. You don't have to not do it ever, but this is the time to put that on pause, right? And again, we're talking about the short-term needs here, so we're talking about getting through the end of this year, funding it next year through the budget, funding it through a capital process, all entirely appropriate. But again, we have to get to next year first. The second thing, which I note here is not ideal, and I'm sure you could find reports from PFM or other consulting firms that would tell you that what I'm about to say is not a best practice, but any port in a storm to some extent. It's to divert some of the federal stimulus monies, what's called ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, I think I got that right, some of the county's remaining funds to close this gap. You would rather use those dollars to invest, right? You get the stimulus dollars, you're going to catch up on some things you need to do that you didn't have the dollars to do now. But again, there is no capital investment if you run out of cash, right? So the diversion of some amount of that money is the next thing. And the last thing, since we're making all kinds of happy recommendations here, is an unfunded debt borrowing. And what that means for residents is a real estate tax increase, right? The county is going to have to borrow money. I don't know that it is the full 11 million, hopefully not. And part of the answer to, well, how much, part of it depends on how the rest of the year goes, right? And part of it depends on what are the first two things worth, right? So what can we not spend money on this year that can drive those costs down? What's available through ARPA that we can drive the amount of borrowing down? Because what an unfunded debt borrowing is, you asked about court, and that's one of the potential ways to do it, is if you go that route, you go and you say, this is a borrowing of last resort. I have to cover my expenses this year. I'm going to pay a higher interest rate because think back to the credit rating report, it's a higher risk. And the only way you're going to fund that next year, you're not going to magically find money under your Christmas tree, you're going to increase real estate taxes. If you borrowed $10 million, just to give folks a sense, what does this convert to? It's about $1.1 million. If we borrow $10 million now, it's about $1.1 million a year for the next 10 years to pay that off, which equates pretty neatly to 1 mil tax increase. So just to give people a sense of tax increases, we're not talking 40% tax increases here, just to give folks a sense of magnitude. One last slide and then I'm done. These are what I believe are the next steps. You've heard our thoughts on our recommendations. We'll work very closely with all three commissioners and with David, whose team has been great to work with throughout, and Brian, and we'll come up with what we think is the right mix. Because how much expenditure cuts, how much ARPA, how much debt, there are many different ways to get there. Some are better than others, but there's not one mathematical right answer. There's one answer that makes sense for Lackawanna County when you consider operations and other factors, but there's not one technical right answer to get there. So getting that mix, coming back probably before this group, probably in a different setting, and saying, this is what we think the right mix is. That's the first thing. Again, cut the anchor off the leg, get the patient out of bed, meet the acute need first. Meanwhile, we are still working on the multi-year projection. We would come back and talk about what that looks like in the context of your budget, because that's the better place to have that. And we are still doing a review of operations. I sat at this table, and some of my colleagues did for the better part of a week a couple weeks ago, met a lot of the people who are in the room, did initial meetings with every department. We're going back to not every department, a subset of them. We're focused on the criminal justice area, and we're focused on employee compensation. Why? Because that's where the money is. That's where most of county government spending is. Along with youth and family services, county governments in Pennsylvania spend money on their courts, on their prison, on their criminal justice system. That's what they do. They don't have county fire departments. They don't have large parks departments. That's where the money is. And the money is in employee compensation, and that does not necessarily, I don't know what that means yet, candidly, in terms of looking at that, but you couldn't make a structural change in county government without talking about what county government pays its employees, because it would be like trying to talk about a pizza pie without talking about the pizza. You couldn't do it. You have to talk about people. So those are the other two things that we're working on right now. I will pause for whatever the commissioners would like to do next.
Okay. Commissioner McGloin, any questions or comments?
Thank you, Gordon and PFM for all the work that you've done. Again, what we are currently dealing with is not a new problem. Commissioner Gahan and myself are simply the first ones to address it. When those that come before don't accept the fact that they have a fiduciary responsibility in this role to do what's right, these are the problems that you have, and these are the problems that one inherits. And in turn, that can that has been kicked down the road has now landed on our feet. And I can guarantee you that we will stop it. This is an administration that for the past 8 months has been very proactive, and we will continue to do so in serving you. We are committed to identifying the most effective solutions for our residents and taxpayers in Lackawanna County. And I do believe that for the first time in years, we are on the cusp of progress here. And as we currently build that roadmap and find ways to foster real growth and expand possibilities, I know that myself, Commissioner Gahan, Dave Bolzoni, Brian Jeffers, and the rest of our administration will continue to work tirelessly to correct our current problems and put Lackawanna County back on track and truly bring it to where it deserves to be.
Thank you. Commissioner Chermak, any questions or comments?
Well, first of all, Gordon, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. And I am part of this administration too. Sometimes people forget that. But, being here the last almost 5 years now, this is stuff that we've been working on. I put together a bipartisan study committee, and it was difficult back then. We couldn't get the cooperation. And, so what you're doing is what we tried to do a few years ago. So I'm excited that we're here to this point. I think it's very, very important. It's something that I've been trying to do since I've been here. I look forward to the future, what you're gonna tell us at our next meeting. And I agree. Dave Bolzoni does a tremendous job. I mean, he's got the weight of the world on his shoulders, and he's one guy, but he does a good job. He communicates well. If I have any questions, I get the answers, so that's great. And Brian, he keeps all of us in line, so he's good. But we're on the right track here. A lot of it is stuff that we've already known, but to bring it to light and have everybody in this room is very, very important. And again, I look forward to this. This is something I've been trying to do since I became a commissioner, so appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just have one question. Can you go back to and make the distinction again, and maybe Mr. Bolzoni can jump in as well, between the cash crunch at the end of the year and the structural deficit?
Sure.
So from my understanding, I think it was 2022 or 2022, 4 million, then it was 8 million,
Yeah.
then it was 15 million. So for this year, although we don't have an actual projection yet, it's safe to say that the structural deficit is going to be north of $15 million. Is that
Absolutely, yes. And Dave should jump in if he wants to, but you're absolutely right. Well, how do you know that? Because if one thing doesn't move and the other does, then they get farther apart. It's very simple math. Real tax revenues or revenues in county government come from the real estate tax, and they don't increase unless you increase the tax rate or you have a reassessment, which is a separate conversation, is something that is, although that won't increase the tax revenues either, because the rates will drop and it should be revenue neutral. But real estate tax revenues generally are a horse that doesn't leave the barn. It just stays there. And expenditures grow because wages increase, gas increases, health insurance increases. Everybody understands this. But if one line is flat and the other line slopes up, they never stay in balance. I mentioned the article this morning in the Reading Eagle about Berks County, and they're having exactly the same conversation for exactly the same reason. They probably have maybe, similar story in terms of tax rates. And there, Commissioner Leinbach has said, look, the two numbers, I know the two numbers, they just don't match. They don't stay in balance.
Thank you. So I do want to thank Gordon and PFM, his entire team, and DCD for their help and their thorough analysis of the county's financial position, and especially for their frank and realistic recommendations on how to proceed. The objective of this entire process is not simply to figure out how to limp through the end of this year. It is to openly identify, assess, and rectify the serious, long-standing, systemic financial problems that Commissioner McGloin and I confronted upon taking office in January. Last year, the previous administration made it to the end of 2023 only by declining to pay about $19 million in bills, while failing to deal with the structural deficit that now is $15 million and climbing. In effect, as was mentioned today, the administration adopted a 12-month budget that included 13 months' worth of expenses. We will not do that. And I have to be honest with you, I've been on this job now for 8 months. It is eerily similar, although there's a lot of differences between the city of Scranton about 10, 11, 12 years ago and where the county is today. And not just as a commissioner, but as a taxpayer. What I've seen in the last 8 months, it's very frustrating to know that this was allowed to just snowball over the years, and people, in my opinion, look the other way. This whole process isn't about evading political responsibility by forever postponing and passing on difficult financial decisions. It isn't about easy political rhetoric regarding tax increases substituting for sound financial policy. It's about finally doing the right thing, definitively identifying the underlying causes of the county government's financial distress and fixing them. It's about long-term, predictable financial stability. In a word, it's about governance. Many of you are familiar with the first rule of holes. That is, if you don't want the hole you're in to keep getting any deeper, stop digging. We intend to stop the incessant digging that has created the precarious situation that county government is in today. And as the presentation you just heard demonstrates, we intend to be transparent about the county's financial problems and how we plan on fixing them. And in keeping with that transparency and the details of the PFM presentation, it's obvious, and was mentioned today by Gordon, that some property tax increase in 2025 is very likely to be one part of the solution. The scope of that likely increase will become more apparent as we work on the PFM recommendations in the 2025 budget. It's also important to note that expenditures have increased drastically over the last few years, while revenues have not. We are working to make county government more efficient, to bring in more revenue, and to cut expenses where we can. We have been engaged in budget hearings since this past Monday, and we are scrutinizing every single line item in the 2025 budget. But let me be clear, the finances are so bad and have been allowed over the years to spiral so far out of control that at this point, anyone who suggests that you can cut your way out of this problem is not telling you the truth, because that is not possible. So I assure you that going forward, we are going to be open and honest about that and every other aspect of righting this ship, and we will right this ship. Thank you, and if anyone has questions, we'll be available, and this meeting has concluded. Thank you.